Throughout history, weather has played a crucial role in warfare. Strong winds in the English Channel did much to destroy the Spanish Armada trying to invade England in 1588. Washington, D.C. was saved from being burnt to the ground by British troops in 1814 courtesy of huge storms, including a tornado. And it's well known that the freezing winter of Russia impeded and ultimately helped destroy the advances of Napoleon Bonaparte. World War II was no different. Once again, Russia's brutal winter thwarted the advance of another enemy. This time, Adolf Hitler's advances into the Soviet Union. And did you know that even D-Day was fundamentally affected by weather? The original invasion was meant to be on June 5, 1944, but had to be changed to June 6 due to ongoing stormy weather near Normandy. A far lesser-known fact is that the Nazis set up a temporary weather station in northern Canada. It would be the only time that the Germans established a foothold on North American soil during World War II. It's a quirky story worth sharing. The Nazis chose northern Labrador, on the northeastern fringe of Canada, as their location for a weather station. It was a perfect spot in that Labrador is a remote and rugged place, full of snow and ice-covered mountains and herds of caribou and roaming polar bears. This was at a time well before GPS and advanced surveillance technology, and so an enemy like Germany could indeed try and get away with setting up a weather station right on Canada's doorstep. Interestingly, Labrador is named after a Portuguese explorer, João Fernandes Lavrador, who sailed along the coast of the peninsula in 1498 and 1499. Northern Labrador itself is a frigid place. While most of Labrador has a subarctic climate, Northern Labrador has to contend with a tundra climate, making it quite a lot colder and drier. Today it forms part of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is Canada's easternmost province of Canada. Labrador is far more sparsely populated than Newfoundland, comprising 71% of the province's area, yet only 6% of its population. In fact, its population is lower than any of the other northern Canada territories, themselves very sparsely populated, namely Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and the Inuit-administered Nunavut Territory. Labrador is remote and geographically unique. It's at the confluence of prevailing currents from the Arctic and off the North Atlantic, perfect for a weather station. The spot chosen by the Nazis for their weather equipment was the shore of Martin Bay just south of Killinick Island. To get there, the Germans set off on September 18, 1943, aboard a U-boat, U-537, which was commanded by Peter Shrew. Their cargo was a prefabricated weather station, formerly known as a Wetterfunkerette Land 26, or WFL-26, and which was codenamed Kurt. It was so named after Dr. Kurt Sommermeier, a German meteorologist. Their trip across the North Atlantic took more than a month, and conditions were no doubt treacherous enough, even at that relatively calmer time of the year. During the trip, U-537 was hit by a heavy storm south of Greenland, which washed away one of the U-boat's gun mountings. The U-boat reached Martin Bay on October 22, 1943, and the weather station equipment was immediately sent to shore via a rubber dinghy. The exact place for the station was on slightly higher ground atop a 53-meter or 174-foot hill, which was about 365 meters or just under 1,200 feet from the shore. It took a small team of 2 meteorologists and 10 armed sailors about 28 hours to set up the equipment. The other men remained on the U-boat doing lookout. Once done, the assembly team returned to the submarine, and U-537 quickly made its way out of Martin Bay, once again in the cover of darkness. U-537 would then proceed on a patrol of the North Sea. The station itself would have consisted of several measuring instruments, as well as a telemetry system and 150-watt Lorentz, 150 FK-type transmitter. There would also have been 10 cylindrical canisters, each of which were about 3 feet or a meter tall, and were quite hefty, weighing approximately 220 pounds or just under 100 kilograms each. One canister would have had a 33-foot or 10-meter high antenna mast attached to it. There would also have been a second shorter mast, which carried an anemometer to measure wind speed and a wind vane. The remaining canisters contained nickel-cadmium batteries, which would power the station. Efforts were made to disguise the facility. The drums were painted black and white to blend into the bleak surrounding environment. Empty American cigarette packs were strewn around to give the impression that the station was an Allied installation. The Germans did make a rather elementary gaffe, though. They stenciled one drum with the name Canadian Meteorological Service. Yet there was no such agency in Canada. Worse still, at that time, Labrador was still a British dominion and not even part of Canada. Labrador only joined Canada as a province in 1949. Even so, lugging all that heavy equipment around would have made for hard, dangerous work. And most of the work was done in the dark, since night already falls early at the time of the year in northern Labrador. Nearly everything on the trip had to be done stealthily and in darkness, since that region of Canada was patrolled by Allied vessels. As such, what was accomplished was no small feat. The German weather station, or WFL, was capable of broadcasting weather readings every 3 hours. This was achieved over a 2-minute transmission on 3,940 kilohertz. In theory, the WFL should have been able to operate for up to 6 months. In reality, the German weather station only ran for about 2 weeks. The Germans never found out why. Perhaps the batteries dried up quickly or the transmissions were jammed. However, there was never any evidence of the Allies having found the temporary Nazi weather station. Why all that effort and danger just to set up a temporary weather station in a remote, treacherous part of the world that would last no more than 6 months? The answer is simple, really. Weather forecasting. The prevailing winds in the North Atlantic and Arctic region, which heavily influence weather conditions in all of Europe, follow a west-to-east jet stream. So what's the big deal? Well, that mass of air flowing in that direction meant that the Americans and Canadians, that is, the Allies, were on the right side of the jet stream. The Germans were at the end of it, meaning the wrong end. That meant the Allies had a huge head start on being able to predict weather patterns, which put the Germans at a very significant disadvantage. The Germans had been obliged to rely on long-range aircraft and weather ships for their weather forecasts. However, these were vulnerable to attack by the Allies. Germany's ability to plan military campaigns based on weather was thus thwarted. They were all too aware of this, and as a result, finding remote places in key locations in the far north became a Nazi obsession. More often than not, that meant having to set up temporary weather stations on territory owned by Allied countries, such as Canada, Greenland, and Iceland, as well as the Arctic region of the Soviet Union. The Nazis had produced 26 of the WFL automatic weather station, of which the one sent to Labrador was the very last. The stations were manufactured by Siemens AG, the German engineering giant. 14 of the stations were deployed in Arctic and subarctic regions, including eastern Greenland, which belonged to Denmark, as well as Spitsbergen, Hopen, and Jan Mayen Island, all located on Norway's far northern Svalbard archipelago. By then, both Denmark and Norway were occupied by the Nazis, but other stations were needed in places belonging to Canada and the Soviet Union. The Nazis were able to establish a manned station located on the Franz Josef Land archipelago, which belonged to the Soviet Union at the time and Russia today. That station lasted from November 1943 to July 1944 until it was discovered and destroyed by the Soviets. In fact, 2 weather stations were to have been set up in North America, but the U-boat carrying the second one was sunk. We could not ascertain where the intended location for the second station would have been in North America. Northern Labrador was chosen because it was 1, remote, 2, ideally located in terms of the northern jet stream, and 3, could provide data that would be especially valuable to the Germans. That's because the weather readings from a station in Labrador could greatly assist in German U-boats trying to sink Allied war and cargo ships in the North Atlantic Ocean. Nothing further was heard from the German weather station known as Kurt for 34 years. It was only in 1977 that a geomorphologist named Peter Johnson came upon the site by pure chance. He certainly wasn't looking for a Nazi weather station. Based on the scattered equipment, Johnson assumed it was a Canadian military installation and named the site Martin Bay 7 with a Borden designation number of JD-07. Johnson and his team of fellow geological specialists formed part of the Torngat archaeological project at the time. It was being conducted for a 2-year period at the behest of the Smithsonian Institution and Bryn Mawr College. The team had successfully located nearly 350 archaeological sites, with the Nazi weather station being just one of them. But it was only in 1981 that it came to light that what was found was indeed a weather station set up by the Nazis. That was thanks to a book being written by a retired engineer named Franz Sellinger. He had contacted Dr. Alec Douglas, the official historian for the Canadian Armed Forces, regarding a reference Sellinger had come across in his studies about a land weather station set up by the Nazis in Labrador. Sellinger had gotten the information from the logbook of U-537. Sellinger and Douglas set off for the location in Labrador that had been logged by the U-boat, and there they found what remained of the Nazi weather station. However, not much of the equipment remained due to 4 decades of exposure to the harsh elements. Dr. Douglas would write about his trip for the December 1981-January 1982 issue of Canadian Geographic. Interestingly, this is what Douglas said he and Sellinger found at the site. "Someone had been there before us. Every canister had been opened. Batteries and radio parts seemed to have been systematically dismantled. The equipment had been deliberately smashed." So who did that to the equipment? It's highly suggestible that it was a group of Inuits who had come across the equipment while fishing or hunting. It's very plausible that it even happened a short while after the Nazis left, given that the station stopped transmitting data within just a few weeks. Or perhaps it was the Canadian or American military after all, and they just kept it under wraps until it no longer mattered. Douglas did note that cables at the site had been cleanly cut. This suggested industrial-grade cutting equipment which is unlikely to have been in the possession of Inuits out hunting or exploring. The remnants of the Nazi weather station were sent to the Canadian War Museum in the Canadian capital of Ottawa, which can be seen as an exhibit to this day. Although very limited in what it achieved and today a small museum display, one thing remains true. The weather station in northern Labrador was the only active Nazi German operation ever undertaken on mainland North America,